In my general biology class, as we look at all of the life on Earth, starting off with bacteria, et cetera, obviously we talk about plants. And plants are important for a number of reasons. And I have then a series of lectures on plants, plant evolution, plant anatomy, and the like. This final lecture is focusing on pollination syndromes, using keys, the diversity of roots, a lot of more things in, say, the other category. Just all of the interesting things about plants before moving on. One thing I just mentioned here is the incredible amount of plant life on Earth. So if you were to take all of the living things on Earth and weigh them, the biomass of plants far outweigh anything else. And so here was an estimate. I'm sorry that we're jumping around a little bit. Here is an estimate of the diverse forms of life on Earth. And as you can see, if the amounts down at the bottom were represented by animals, maybe 2 gigatons, protists 4 gigatons, archaea 7 gigatons. Notice, for example, we think a lot about animals, but the amount of animals on Earth is small. That there are certainly a lot of fungi, there are a lot of bacteria, both the eubacteria and the archaea. But if you were to look at the amount of plants, the biomass of plants outweighs everything else combined multiple times. And so plants are certainly worth discussing for lots of reasons. And on an aside, that's why with climate change, we worry about deforestation and the cutting down of trees, because that represents such a big sink for carbon. Now, there are lots of types of plants, as I've reviewed in other videos. Virtually everything that I say about today will not be about the more primitive groups of plants, like the ferns or even the gymnosperms, like pine trees, but rather the great diversity of the flowering plants, the angiosperms. This was the last group of plants to evolving in the Jurassic period, where everything else came prior to that. And and they make the vast majority of plants today. Now, that surprises a lot of people. And one of the reasons is for a misunderstanding about what a flower is. So that'll be part of this lecture. Flowers are not just these very colorful structures which we see here, but these trees are flowering plants. It just so happens that their flowers are pollinated by the wind, and therefore aren't colorful, and perhaps aren't as obvious a type of flower. So here you can see the different groups of plants evolved at different points in Earth's history, whereas the flowering plants, the last major group to evolve, the first appearing in the Jurassic period. There are many types of plants, and they evolved at gradual points in history. So flowering plants form this great family tree with approaching 300,000 species, which have been identified, and probably many more that haven't been identified. And the two largest groups are what we call the monocots, which include things like orchids, rice, wheat, palm, bamboo, bananas, tulips, daffodils, and the eudicots, which include most trees, but then also many important crop plants like citrus, carrots, beans, potatoes, and many popular flowers like roses, etc. Now, when it comes to flowers, obviously we can talk about what a basic structure of a flower is. It's a set of whorls of modified leaves. And so we have sepals on the very outside. These are typically green, but they don't have to be, such as the poinsettias which are popular in December. The big red structures are not the petals, they are sepals. So some flowering plants have colorful sepals. There can be petals, a whorl which then attracts pollinators, but then there can be two whorls of reproductive structures. The male structures, the whole whorl is known as the androecium, which is consisting of a set of stamens. Each stamen has an anther where the pollen is produced, and then a filament. And then the innermost structures, the gynecium, the female structures, which consist of one or multiple carpels. And each carpel then can have a stigma, where the pollen grains land, a style through which the pollen tubes have to grow, and then the ovary. Now, flowers vary. So flowers don't have to have all of these. So some flowers lack petals. There are some flowers which only have the male structures, some which only have the female structures. So in some plants, the entire plant can be male or female, or you can have a plant with male and female flowers, but not on the same flower, so that there are male flowers and then female flowers on the same plant. Or the male flowers may bloom at a different time as the female flowers. So there's lots of variations which are possible. Now, why flowers, in general? Well, here's the first reason, but then there will be variations on this. These two flowers, they would like to mate. The problem is they have roots and they can't move. So if they're on opposite sides of a swamp, how could they reproduce together? And the answer is they can attract the animals which do move. And so if they provide free food for animals in the form of nectar or even pollen, then an animal might visit the flower. So for example, this bee comes to visit this flower for the free food. In the process, the bee, which wants the flower to succeed, as we'll see, they have co-evolved together to help each other out. And so this bee benefits from the success of the flowers, just as the flower benefits from the success of the bees. As this bee is getting a free meal at the first flower, this hairy bee, it doesn't have true hairs, but the bristles on the bee collect pollen, and the bee has once again evolved to help the flower out. So it's covered by these hairs which can trap the pollen. And then when it flies to the second flower to get a free meal, it can then drop off the pollen from flower number 1 to flower number 2. Now, pollen grains contain sperm. The most primitive plants have flagellated sperm, as we see in animals, but in the flowering plants, no sperm have the flagella. They simply grow through the pollen tube. And so the sperm of flower number 1 can now fertilize the ovary and the ovum of flower number 2. And it was the animal which transported the sperm from one flower to the other. So these two flowers have just had sex, thanks to the animal transporting the sex cells, the gametes. And as a result, we can see that the flower is trying to encourage this by blue petals with bee lines. These lines help to guide the bee towards the interior of the flower. They can even be in ultraviolet light. And so flowers can choose different colors because different pollinators prefer different colors. And so many flowers then have sex with the help of an animal. Now, as we look at flowers, clearly the structure of the flower varies. I mean, look how easy it is to get to the reproductive parts of that flower. You can see differences in color. Once again, here you can see all of those stamens, very easy to get to. So any animal brushing along this would get pollen on itself. Some flowers have a more complicated structure because pollinators vary in their ability to access these parts of flowers. So for example, these stamens are in the open, and so this might attract a number of pollinators. This looks like a bee. It's actually not. It's a fly that resembles bees. Here's a beetle fertilizing these flowers. So some flowers have a very generalized structure and can therefore attract diversity of pollinators, from ants to flies to beetles to bees to butterflies to hummingbirds. There's a great diversity of pollinators out there. But sometimes flowers would like to be choosier, because if pollinators are going from flowers of one species to flowers of another species, then pollen from species number one is now being deposited in flower number two. And so that if that flower's a different species, then that is energy wasted that didn't go towards reproduction. So the flowers would prefer if the pollinator, after visiting a flower of this species, then visited a flower of the same species. So sperm from one member of the species is now being deposited on that of another species. If the pollinator goes from this flower to this flower, the sperm from this flower cannot fertilize the ova of this flower. So that was energy wasted in producing those sperm. And so many flowers then specialize so that their pollinators are now training just on that type of flower. So that's where color can come in. So for example, butterflies and hummingbirds can see the color red. Bees don't, they see it as black. So having red flowers is trying to attract things other than bees primarily. Bees are very strong as pollinators go. And so something like an iris, you have to force apart the petals to reach the nectar. Many pollinators simply cannot do that. And so bees would then be selected for as the pollinator of choice there. Butterflies and moths can have a long proboscis, and so some flowers are accessed that way. And so that could specialize for butterflies. Some flowers actually look and smell like sweat, or look and smell like rotting flesh. They are trying to attract flies. Flies are the preferred pollinator. Here, some flowers open at night. They are selecting for moths or maybe bats in other parts of the world. There are some orchids where the flowers resemble female wasps, at least to the point of view of the male wasps, which then try to mate with the flower. Some flowers are tubular, attracting either butterflies or hummingbirds. So you notice these tubular flowers with the nectar here, the only way to access that is to hover here as a hummingbird can do. And then notice that the hummingbird, as it hovers, may get pollen on the feathers of its head, which then as it visits the next flower, it might deposit on the female parts, the stigma of that flower. And so in trying to encourage flowers or pollinators to visit one type of flower. So cardinal flower that you just saw is long and tubular. Once again, hummingbirds are good at pollinating this type of plant. And because it is red, it is something that is less likely to attract bees. So here you see a hummingbird being attracted to these red tubular flowers. And so flowers are making, flowering plants are making flowers in order to have sex. And how to do that most efficiently then can vary. And so that's why we see this great diversity of flower structure and form, because there's many different types of pollinators out there, and pollinators have different strategies. That being said, many flowering plants do not use animals, but rather the wind. So the first set of images, those were clearly flowers, but these are flowers as well. So, oak trees are flowers, grass is a flower, and someone would like to argue. So for example, if there were two individuals going on a date and one, handed the other a handful of grass or of, the structure from an oak tree, very few people would consider that person one has given the other one flowers, but they have. Right, they've just given them flowers which aren't pollinated by animals, but rather pollinated by the wind. So plants which are trying to use animals to carry their gametes have to attract the animals, and that's why they have brightly colored petals or sweet-smelling nectar and the like. But if a plant is being pollinated by the wind, obviously the wind doesn't care what color you are, or if you smell nice, it's going to blow one way or the other. And so therefore, these flowering plants simply put their male structures, the stamens, where they are exposed to the wind, and then the wind then blows pollen, which is often structured so that the wind is more likely to carry it. And then there is simply then the hope that somewhere downwind, this pollen will, by dumb luck, reach the female parts of flowers of the same species. Now, this is wasteful. One must produce far more pollen this way, but one saves the energy that one would otherwise make using, petals and free food for the animals, which are no longer needed. So flowers are far more diverse than most people think. It's just that many flowers are pollinated by the wind and therefore aren't brightly colored and don't typically smell noticeably, well. There are also some flowers which can be pollinated by the water. And so flowering plants represent 300,000 different species, by far the majority of flowering plants. And there is quite a diversity of these flowers. Here you see in the Caribbean, there is a bird other than a hummingbird, which is specialized for the pollination of flowers. And notice the very specialized structure of the flowers, which have adapted to this bird. And so many of the flowering plants have evolved with the pollinators, so that the orchid looks like the female wasp of the species, where the males attempt to mate with the flowers, or that the structure of the bird's beaks, notice the curve on both the hummingbird and the bananaquit bird, matches that of the flower being pollinated. And once again, not all flowers do that. Some flowers are just far more generalized, with the idea that many different pollinators might visit this flower. And so here is an invasive species, Japanese knotweed, but its flowers are very easy to access and aren't overly specialized. And so here you're going to see bees, wasps, flies, beetles, a diversity of pollinators. So some flowers are pollinated by only one type of pollinator, and others have a more generalized structure and then can be pollinated by a diversity of flowers, of pollinators.